I want you to think about your position in the marketplace, in the landscape, in your company, because customer success is at the intersection between the customer and the company. And in my mind, this is the most strategic, most impactful role. I think it's key to why we see CS leaders and CCOs becoming CEOs and investors and board members. Those leaders that have already made that jump, they've understood their position and their influence, and they've become those business leaders. So if you don't already think of yourself as a business leader, and I'm going to make certain I can see the chat, I want you to start thinking about yourself as a business leader from this day forward. It should be your mindset and your mantra. So right now, I want you to write in the chat, I am a post-sales revenue leader, and I want you to hit enter. And I'm not going to move on until I start to see that. Fantastic. Look at that next to your name. Everyone, I want you to do that. Fantastic. Now I want you to start typing again, and I want you to type, I am a business leader. Okay? I'm a post-sales revenue leader. I'm a business leader. See that next to your name. This is key to how we all need to progress in our profession. All right. Let me go to the next slide. Heck. All right. Do that here. Excellent. Keep doing it. I want to see that. Keep going. Yes. Excellent. All right. Now I have a few slides just to give some context. One is some startup stats. I'm not going to read through all of them, but they're not really going to be a surprise because we've seen startups from the inside and it's not very pretty. But look especially at points 5, 6, and 7, right? 80% of tech startups fail. A quarter to a third of VC-backed startups fail. And less than 5% of startups break even on cash flow, right? All of these kinds of stats, this is kind of important. And this is what we're going to be talking about today. So I want you to think about, now, we may not be able to control these numbers, but because of our unique role, we have a unique power to influence them. Okay, another thing, ZIRP. You may not know what ZIRP is, but you've actually been living it, right? Because this is our tech bubble. This is the source of GAC, growth at any cost, right? And that's because investors were acting rationally. They had nothing else to do with their money when money didn't cost anything and it wasn't really earning them anything. You couldn't put it in a savings account and earn anything. That wasn't going to do you any good. So they were investing loads of money in these tech startups, and we had money to play with, right? So when they were trying to go to that unicorn status, they would just throw people at a problem. And the typical thing would be, instead of finishing a product build, they'd fill the gap with a CSM, right? So like CSMs are emailing reports to a customer that otherwise they should have been able to download and configure themselves, right? Things like that. I know this sounds familiar to you because I know that you lived it, right? Gemma, did you have something you wanted to ask?
No, I was just like, I can relate.
Right? Exactly. We can. We've all lived through this. All right. Now, what we've also been living through is now money started to cost something, right? This is PEG, profitable, enduring growth. That is what this era is. Now, think about it. Our companies need to be both profitable and grow now, not how it was before. Our behavior needs to change, right? This is, I mean, if you look at it since 2008, this is, and it was really cheap in between 2015 and 2020. So it's about 15, 20 years of our behavior that needs to change. Don't even get me started on the neural pathways and all the things we need to do to change it. I'll go down neuroscience tangent. But another slide I want to share with you for context as we dig into this is thinking about company maturity, right? Because not all metrics are created equal. We care about different things at different times. So when we're in this startup phase of product market fit, that's kind of seed and series A, or go to market fit, we should be thinking about that in kind of when we're in that series B to series C stage, right? Then you start to scale. When you get to series C, you're getting past 100 employees, you're getting past 10 million. You need to start scaling your processes. It can't just be in your head anymore. No, we've lived this, right? Then we're getting to be a little bit more mature. We're really sort of scaling up. We need to be more, productivity focused. And then this is where we get to sort of unicorn and, in yesteryear, sort of IPO, maybe IPOs will come back, but this is sort of the stages, sort of going from, baby, into teen and early adulthood, if you want to think of it that way in terms of company maturity. Also, another thing I'll just mention is like startup. VCs are sort of thinking of startup, like in the first 5 years of a company, and you become a scale up, and none of this is like black and white, but scale up is generally considered like 3 consecutive years of 20% average annualized growth, right? These are some of the signs that an investor is looking for a healthy startup, like saying, hey, I want to invest in you. Now, why do we care about what these investors think? Well, in part because if you are in a recurring revenue model, it takes a lot of upfront investment to when you finally get to that break-even point and then get to that hockey stick growth. So we rely on these investors, right? We rely on venture capital. So who is venture capital? LPs, limited partners, they're investing in the fund. GPs, general partners, they manage the fund. Generally, the LPs, they're trying to get a 7 to 10 year return. That's what the GPs, the general partners who manage the fund, are promising them. So they're trying to figure out what kinds of metrics that will help them bet on the right horse, so to speak. And as startups, we want that money from investors. So we need to show them, hey, I'm worthy of that bet. That's why now we care about these types of metrics and what we're going to cover today. I want to just go back for a second, though, and just look at this company maturity. We're looking at it because not all metrics are made the same. What we're looking at is that, just a second. What we're looking at is that EBITDA is kind of later. And I'll get into what EBITDA is, but I just want you to associate it with sort of later stage. Then you have Rule of 40, which you've probably heard of, and we'll cover what that is. This is sort of the mid stage. This is where you're scaling and productivity. And then growth stage is going to be where we're looking at different types of metrics where we're looking at growth. So just keep this in mind as I go through these different metrics. I'll be referring to these sort of 3 sort of general stages. Okay, getting back to EBITDA, Rule of 40, LTV, and CAC ratio. So these metrics didn't always exist. They're not even a part of general accounting terms or anything like that. These are basically made up metrics because investors are trying to figure out, again, who to bet on. There was a time when there were companies that would sort of gloss over and their problem revenue areas by including depreciation and amortization and things like that. So investors created EBITDA, which is to strip away those other things and strip it away. So they're just looking at earnings, which is revenue, right? They're like, basically like, forget all this other stuff. I want to know, what is your actual revenue? And that's what EBITDA does. Okay, so forget all of the, what it all stands for, blah, blah, blah. EBITDA is about what is your revenue. Then in 2010, cloud tech came about and we had recurring revenue models, right? And they needed to evaluate these businesses, because look, they're making big money. I want to get in on that, but how do I know which one to bet on? So they started to come up with other metrics. And in 2015, Bessemer Venture Partners, you may or may not have heard of them, but I know you've heard of Rule of 40. But basically, they came up and said to the rest of the community, we think we have a way of looking at growth and profit margin. And this is a key way to understand if this is a good bet. So that's why they came up with Rule of 40. And let's see, is it going to come? Come on. There we go. So basically what you're looking at is you can get to the score of 40 by looking at, say, year over year growth. Let's say you have 20% year over year growth, which is what they're sort of looking for, 3 consecutive years. And then you get to 20% profit margin. And then that would give you a score of 40. Anything 40 or higher is fantastic. And that's why they would want to invest in you. There's some other variations. Now there's like Rule of X, which emphasizes growth more and gives more value to that. There's also like free cash flow. All of those are sort of like some details that I'm not going to bother you with. What I want you to understand is Rule of 40 is about growth and profit. Okay, understanding that. Okay, now there's also a couple other things I'll mention around OpEx. We'll get into that in a second, how it's considered. Well, I'll deal with that later. It's 40. These are all very interrelated in terms of where they show up on the P&L. So I'll get to those things later, but I want you to understand that there's OpEx and COGS that we're going to be talking about. OpEx is usually where sales sits. COGS is usually where CS has sat traditionally. And the way that your profit, if you look in this bottom left-hand corner, where it says gross margin is the same as profit margin, and that is revenue minus COGS. So COGS is weighing down the profit, right? And I want you to think about that. If you are part of COGS, then you are weighing down profit, right? That's kind of heavy when you're weighing it down. All right. LTV CAC ratio. What is that? Lifetime value over customer acquisition cost. Customer acquisition cost, the good news is, if you're looking at that, that is what it costs for sales and marketing to bring in a customer, right? Lifetime value is the retention of that customer. And what investors are generally looking for is a 3-to-1 ratio, right? Or better. And so that is where we start to have some influence over what investors are looking at. There's also ways in which we can impact the Rule of 40, but all of this is to say, think about what these metrics are. What are they looking for? How do they understand how they're betting on you in this process, right? So am I coming across clear here? Are there any key questions that I should answer before I move on? Okay, good. Then let's move on to COGS and OpEx. COGS. COGS is cost of goods sold. Technically for tech, it's cost of services sold, but we just refer to it as COGS. If you are retention focused, and we all need to be because we're the post-sales motion, right? But if anything that's just focused on retention, your COGS. OpEx, if you are revenue focused, then you're under operating expenses. So if you have part of your team that is revenue focused and part of your team, say support and onboarding and other things like that, that are retention focused, you could be split and be represented in both OpEx and COGS. Something to think about. What I want to challenge you though is, do you know, are you all COGS? Are you COGS and OpEx? Where do you show up in your P&L? Does anybody know? Can you put in the chat, do you know where you are? Certainly it depends on the company. If you're in a company right now, do you know, or your most recent company, do you know where you were in the P&L? Great. Great. Good. Okay, exactly. Thanks, Jay. That's fantastic. Okay, so this is really important. Another thing you may have heard of is above and below the line. Again, above the line is when you're looking at revenue minus COGS to get to your gross profit. And then below the line is things like OpEx and the other sort of EBITDA things, right? So above the line, below the line, again, COGS and OpEx figure in prominently with that. So I just wanted to make reference to that. Now, another area is break even, unit economics, and margins. So there's a lot of information on here. So let me talk about where we're at with this. CAC payback may be something that you've heard of. CAC payback is what is often what investors will look at. And that's basically the months to pay back the cost to acquire the customer, right? Because they want to keep those costs in check and understand that you're not just going to town and willy-nilly spending so much on sales and marketing that it doesn't allow you to become profitable. So that's what they're checking on that. But the customer break-even point is something I want you to focus on. Yes, you should know what the CAC payback is, but I want you to think about beyond that. I want you to think about all of the costs. I want you to add up CAC, cost of onboarding, support, CSM, all of those things, right? And then I want you to add up all of your revenue, both the contract value as well as any one-time revenue. Okay. Then I want you to get all of that information on a per customer basis and then roll that up into per segment. What you now will understand by understanding what your costs and revenue and your margin from each customer and your segments is that you understand who is profitable and why, and who's going to literally run you out of business and why. This is where you, at the intersection between the customer and the company, this is where you can come back and inform the rest of your company. You can inform product, you can inform marketing and sales. This is who our ideal customer profile is and why. This is who we shouldn't be selling to, or else we're going to go out of business. And you have real data to show it, right? If you hear about unit economics, that's basically revenue and cost measured on a per unit basis. And if you think about what your unit is, it's a customer, right? So that's just a way of thinking about your costs on a per customer basis. And then customer success margin is something where you can calculate that to think about what it is actually costing you to deliver services to each customer, or overall how profitable your team is, right? Because this is something, especially if you're part of COGS, then your CFO might be looking at you and saying, we got to cut you out. We got to be more profitable. We're going to cut, you're the biggest expense. We got to cut you out. But what you want to show is actually we're responsible for the company bottom line, right? When you think about cohorts, when you think about all of your customer base, your cohorts that were just sold into, that you have everybody ringing the gong about, they were just sold in, that is new business. Everything else, and when you get to Series B and beyond, 75 to 95%, I've seen 97% of a company bottom line that keeps everybody in business being post-sales, right? And if that's the case, you've got to keep the lights on. That's your responsibility. You should glorify it. You should call to action and let everyone see, hey, we're where the money is, right? This is it. And so when you call out by cohort how much money is responsible under your purview for the company bottom line, then they understand how to focus on building up the revenue from your current customer base. And you get everybody on board trying to go towards that North Star of serving the customer with you, right? Hopefully that's clear. I didn't go through all of the points on this slide, but all of these things are also covered in my free guide. So please download that as well. Now, the last area, and I'm going through it pretty quickly, so I think we're going to have a lot of time for discussion and questions, which I'm excited about. Quotas versus projections versus CSQL systems and communication. These are key. So the quotas that are probably getting handed down to you, those are usually top down. And where they usually come from is not market conditions or what's happening with your customer base. Quotas are usually coming from, what do we need to do to look good, to position ourselves for the next funding round? Oh, we need X million. Or, oh, what do we need to do to keep the lights on? And we don't have a lot of new revenue coming in. So, okay, we need X million from post sales. Then they give you a quota, right? Now, projections are bottom up. You need to provide that. No one else can. If you don't provide projections, all you have is quota, or you have a big question mark. And P&L needs a number, so you can't afford to have a question mark, right? So if you're complaining about a quota that's been imposed, I want to challenge you and ask you, what have you done to provide projections? Another way you can provide projections, and a key way to build out your projections, is to have a CSQL system. A CSQL is a CS qualified lead. This is where you go through and you identify the revenue that's coming up for renewal, for potential white space for expansion, and who might purchase more products from you and be successful using those products, right? So that's where you want to take a look at identifying not only where the potential is, but then plans for how you're going to achieve that. If you have a CSQL system set up where then you can also have stretch goals for your CSMs on what they're going to renew or expand in your revenue, then you understand kind of what you're committing to, what you're going to have as sort of a stretch goal, and even identify which things are completely at risk. You'll have that data. Also, what you'll have is ways of identifying referrals and your champions who might be able to refer new business, new customers in, which is the most efficient way to generate revenue, because they skip all the marketing, they skip all the prep in the sales, and they go straight to sort of like, if you're thinking about a funnel, they go straight into like the middle or lower part of that sales process. They're faster to close. They're more likely to be successful. This is something I talk about in blogs on my website. This is something that Aaron Thompson talked about last month for CS Angel. It's also something we talked about last night at CX Exchange Success Hour with our co-lead, where we were talking about how to set up a pipeline. All of these things are available to you. It's also something I talked about in the free guide. So if you don't have a CSQL system, and it's not like you can snap your fingers and set it up, you can build one. It isn't hard to do. It's just something that's intentional, where you measure and track this, as well as measuring and tracking your advocates and who's bringing in referrals and how you're generating revenue that is literally more efficient and effective for your company, right? These are all key things that we do in post sales, right? Another thing I'll mention, though, is communication, because if you're not communicating this, tree falls in a forest, if you didn't hear it, it literally didn't happen. You need to communicate this. You need to rally people together so that they're joining forces toward that North Star of the customer, and they need to understand their part in how we bring all of our company towards this unified goal of the customer and the company achieving their business goals, right? The customer's business goals, when they achieve them, that allows us to then in turn achieve our business goals. Right. This is pretty much what I was going to cover. I apologize if I went quickly. I had a lot of slides and I was worried that I was going to not get through them all. I will definitely go to questions before I do that, and we can go back through any of these slides that are useful. But this is where the guide is. I do have a course that's going to be coming up soon. It's project-based with a coaching cohort and community, so you can impact your company and your customers while you work through all of these new terms. And then also, as I mentioned, we cover these topics and we have been focusing on this area, especially since beginning of February. So come and join us there. And this is all the ways you can reach me. Now, let's open this up for a conversation. Gemma, I know you probably weren't thinking of having this much time for a conversation, but this is how I do it this is how I do it every week, for Success Hour. So I feel like I can't just talk. I need to hear from people.
I agree.
Yeah. What are your questions, or what are some insights that people want to share? If you've been doing some of this already, I want to hear from you. Or if you have questions, like, I want to get started, but where do I start? Or what did you mean by that? Let's dig in now.
Awesome. We have some questions already lined up.
Good.
I'll kick one off myself.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think a lot of people attending today are going to be no strangers to the pressure of trying to find opportunities to expand revenue from their existing customer base.
Yeah.
What kind of techniques would you recommend to do this? I know you've mentioned CSQLs, but what other techniques would you recommend to people who are kind of struggling to find a strategy to expand their customer revenue?
Yeah, so this is actually a topic that we're going to be talking about next Tuesday, actually, because
nice.
When you think about, and because we've been going through a series of how, comparing sort of like pre-sales to post-sales and some of the practices of sales that we can adopt and use in post-sales. And when you think about in that funnel that we're used to, understanding for sales process, right? They're going through and meticulously looking at these conversions, right? Like they're tracking all of these things that technically aren't money. They don't get to money until the very end, right? All of the things that they're tracking before these conversions are how many people were familiar, whatever, noticed us versus clicked on us versus, like all the way through in every sales conversation. What is the objective of this sales conversation? Did they meet it or not? All of those things that they're tracking, these are things that we could be tracking as well. We track metrics like time to first value or something like that, but how often are we really tracking all of the points, say, in terms of adoption? And how many of our tools are being adopted and by whom or percentage, or like whatever is the key adoption metric, things like that we could be tracking. All of those things then help you identify who's actually ready to, going to successfully renew or who's going to expand. When you set up key things to track that are basically our own conversion rates, then you have a way of identifying, am I on track and how much am I on track for? It's literally that we need to turn this into data points, not only for our own understanding and setting up our own goals, but also so we can communicate it back to others in our company.
Yeah, totally. I'm reminded of how sales leaders, like someone who's a VP of sales or a chief revenue officer, they will break down different aspects of the sales funnel, and then it will be a question of improving conversion here to drive revenue there. And with marketing leaders, they're doing the same thing. They may be considering different channels, and looking at what channels are going to be most successful in converting for them to improve the revenue that they bring in that early stage funnel. So if I'm hearing you correctly, in CS, the opportunity is to start to attribute all of the things that we do in CS to revenue. So it could be, it could be the examples you were saying about certain usage indicators, but it could also be things like, our customers who are certified more likely to expand, or our customers who attend this webinar more likely to expand, so that you can come up with different strategies to drive expansion that don't just like rely on, focusing on the customers who have renewals open.
Well, and it allows you to be more proactive, right? We always talk about being proactive, but when you have this data where you understand what your objective is in any of these key moments, then it allows you to actually think about, did I convert them? Did they actually go and do the thing that I need them to do? Because otherwise what can happen is we can be a little bit aimless. And it's like, oh yeah, but then they really needed help with this support thing. So then I did that instead because that's what presented itself. Well, instead of thinking about what's presenting and coming at you, think about how you can make something happen, how you can lean forward and be intentional and make the next thing happen. And understand then, is this activity worth your time? Does it lead towards the behavior you need towards renewal, or does it lead towards the behavior you need that gets you expansion? Because ultimately that's what makes them successful. And if you're doing all these other things, there's also relationship building things, talking about dogs and cats and things like that, maybe, whatever, but and I always usually have a cat in my background, but other than that, like really what you're doing besides building relationships, even that has a purpose, right? And so thinking about being intentional and thinking about what that purpose is. Are you multi-threaded in the organization, right? Who do you need to build a relationship with? Because you can spend all day long with your champion, but are you multi-threaded in the way that you need to be in the organization?
Right. And attributing something like that, like how many people are we multi-threaded with? How much more likely are we to expand that in the event that we are? I love it. Okay, we have some questions which have been typed in. If anyone wants to raise their hand and ask a question, they can come off mic and do it if that's more comfortable. But I'm just going to start reading out some of these ones that have been typed in. So let's start with one from Jay Sanchez. Jay asks, how do we as CS revenue leaders identify which one of these is top of mind for our org? Assuming CFO, but wondering if there's other areas to identify this info. I believe this was around the COGS versus OPEX discussion. So yeah, could you help Jay out with identifying where his team sits? Like, what should he do to figure out where they sit?
Well, you got to ask the question,
Should he ask?
Yeah, basically you need to get a look at the P&L, and if they can't show it all to you because of your role in the company, then maybe your leader, is looking at it. But basically you do need to understand where you sit in the organization. So at the very least, in a conversation, they should be able to answer that question and what their thinking is behind it. If you find that you're in COGS and you do want to reorient it, it's not like, oh, okay, well, can you just put us over in OPEX instead? Like, that's not like a quick, like one and done sort of thing. You have to think about, are you impacting revenue? And if you are, how do you make that case and communicate that so that then you can show up in a different place in your P&L that gives you a different sort of leverage, and also frankly leads to better profitability ratios when you're looking at what they want to achieve in their goals. So there is something in it for them if you help them understand that.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jay, if you have a specific situation that you want to talk through?
Oh, it was EBITDA and Rule of 40 is what Jay was referring
okay,
to.
my bad.
Okay, so for
All
EBITDA
right.
and Rule of 40, what was the question again, so I can think of that?
So the question was more to do with how do we identify which of these is front of mind for our org?
Oh, okay. Well, a lot of times, especially if you're in a startup, you want to think about kind of what are the primary goals? Like, what stage are you in? Are you Series B going to C? Are you C going to D? That sort of thing, right? And based upon that, what are the key things that are important to the executive leadership as they're going for that funding? What do they need to show to those investors? So if that's the case, then they may not even be thinking about Rule of 40 so much. You, as a company, because you might need to have a longer runway, you might be thinking about profitability and thinking about, what your cash flow is, because you need to keep the lights on in order to stay in business long enough to get to that next round of funding. So there's that you might be thinking about profitability. But otherwise, if you are seed, Series A, Series B, chances are they're going to be much more focused on what your growth is than on, say, Rule of 40, where they're looking at profitability and growth. You may be thinking about profitability just because how long do you have before you can get more investment, right? When you get to thinking about Rule of 40, it's really because you're thinking about that funding and what questions you're going to get. Rule of 40 isn't the only thing. They're also looking at LTV to CAC ratios. They're also looking at a variety of different ways to indicate, are you overspending in any particular areas? This is where I was also trying to talk about, and I'm not sure if I really covered it enough, but when you're looking at sales and marketing, they're basically expecting that 20% of overall revenue is going to go to sales and marketing, or to basically to OpEx. Within sales, well, actually 40% goes to OpEx from overall revenue. Usually then they think of 20% of that going to sales and marketing, and the rest going to things like product and engineering to build out the product, that sort of thing. If you, as CS, are part of that overall number of 40% of revenue that comes off the top before you get to taking COGS out, right? If you are part of that 40%, then you basically, that's how you get access to having more revenue for training and tools to help you meet your numbers, things like that. That's why sales and marketing have been able to, why you see so many tools to support them, right? Because they have that slush fund to spend on those things. That's why there's so much enablement helping sales, because there's been so much focus on getting the growth of customers in. They want to make certain that the AE is able to convert at every stage. So that type of rationale is also then what you can bring to your CS team, right? And how you start to make the case for, hey, we're trying to impact revenue. I need training for my team to get there. We're trying to impact revenue. I need tools to give me that understanding of our profitability and of our conversion rates along the way, so that we can be intentional and proactive and get us to that revenue.
Yeah.